Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good afternoon, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Broadcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. So again, we are continuing our focus on Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine, and a significant component of that conflict has been the clouding or outright denial of the Russian military and political leadership of their military actions and intent. Russia has conducted this disinformation campaign through diplomatic, social media, entertainment channels, and other channels and forms of media in an effort to convince the world, as well as their own public, that they are not doing what all the evidence strongly suggests that they are doing. So to help us understand this and understand some of the implications and counters to it, we have Mr. Arvin Verma. Arvin Verma is a highly motivated cybersecurity professional with over 10 years of experience across a multitude of cyber and information technology domains. He's worked in multiple industries spanning more than five Fortune 500 companies and Big Four consulting. In addition, Arvin is proudly serving in the U.S. Navy Reserves as a Cryptologic Warfare Officer. He also serves as a research fellow with the Cybersecurity Forum Initiative, where he has co-authored several research papers in new cyber trends and best practices, and holds several leadership positions with InfraGard Chicago and InfraGard National. He also serves as an advisor to several private and public entities and is a guest lecturer at several universities across the state of Illinois. So, Mr. Verma, welcome to the show, and I will let you turn it over to you for your opening comments.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. This is something that's quite close for a lot of not only the military side, but also within private organizations, and even within my day job. There's been some interesting considerations in how we're able to continue to operate. So before I begin, standard legal disclaimer. So all these statements and comments are my own opinions, do not reflect my employer Abbott, do not reflect the Department of Navy or the Department of Defense as well, or any of the groups I'm affiliated with. So getting that out of the way. Right now we're seeing a large spectrum and a large impact of use of technology to be able to drive a lot of these disinformation and propaganda type efforts. And how are we best able to get ahead of them without the ability to essentially limit our operations to continue free communications, predominantly within the U.S. and what we have defined within the First Amendment. So it'll certainly be interesting to see how this continues and how this continues to play out from the military and the United States government's perspective on how we do our information operations, but then also within private sector and potentially some new legislation, not only from the United States, but also from the United Nations.
So initially, if you can maybe give us some thoughts on what you've been seeing, both from the Russian military and government to civil organizations, what have they been trying to convey with their disinformation campaign? And conversely, I think, we've both been seeing a counter campaign, if you will, from the Ukrainian side. And when you sort of, so one, what has the Russian message been, and what audience are they trying to get it resonate with? But also this definitely seems to be sort of a difference in quality between their message and the Ukrainian counter message, to the point where certainly I ask myself, like, who do they think is, fooled by any of this, right? Because some of it seems either, transparent or clumsy, ham-handed kind of thing, or a combination of the two.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting perspective. Typically, as we know, and those that have been in, especially within the information operations space, a lot of this work is quite extensively planned out and very, very strategic, very focused. I know we were talking about this earlier before we started the recording, but there was a video that was circulating of a deep fake of President Zelensky where he was trying to convince the Ukrainian people and the international community that what Russia was doing was not wrong, either legally or morally. But that deepfake was actually very easily able to be deciphered as a fake. And in addition, the messaging that President Zelensky has been putting out is rather contradictory towards it. So it was very easy to determine that effort. And right now we're seeing, in my opinion, a mad scramble uh, by the Russian government as a way to effectively justify this. At the same time, they're in a state of panic. I've been seeing a lot of videos that are showing where a supermarket where the Russian citizens were fighting over packets of sugar, right? So this may be um, a low quality effort to be able to dissuade opinions. It's not working effectively. However, we look at the Russian mindset. We know they can do better, and we've seen them do a lot better work. So, in my opinion, I think they're just in a state of panic right now, and they're trying to sufficiently address everything before proceeding with more broader kinetic forms of warfare uh, to other countries that are involved. And I think with what we're seeing with the closeness to some of the kinetic impact near Poland, maybe the fallout will increase and drive some more further action. But fortunately, we have a lot smarter folks than us than in government that are able to evaluate and consider this. So I'm sure they've thought of every single scenario of how this can play out. Uh, Hopefully that answers the starting question.
Yeah, so actually, I want to kind of draw out some of what you just said. There was, one, knowing that they can do better because we have seen that historically, but also the fact that they're not, seems to reflect a state of panic or at least extreme, um, not definitely not expecting things to go the way they were going, which leads me to the next question. The images I used to advertise this actually, I picked because those to me were two examples of sort of like the the highest level of the people, like the experts, the veterans you would trot out there if you were to try and get your message across. So for those in the audience who and for those who are listening later who may not have seen the promotion for this, one of them was Sergei Lavrov, who is the chief foreign minister for Putin and for the Russian Federation. He's the guy they send to big conferences where decisions are supposed to be made. Although, as we've been finding out in some of the good negotiations, he's really not the decision maker. I think his Ukrainian counterpart actually had some very sarcastic comments about that, about Lavrov's ability to make his own decisions. But he is the public face of foreign policy for Russia outside of Putin. The other one was Maria Butina, who is I believe now she's a Russian member of parliament, but she sort of got more fame for being over here in the U.S. several years back as I don't know if sleeper is the right term, but a social media influencer for certain political elements within the American political spectrum, and she was eventually uncovered, and I think she did a little bit of jail time and then sent back home, and now she's star in Russian parliament. But again, she has been trotted out specifically to sort of tell the message. And in both cases, like the no, we can do better. Like you have, they're practiced, call them practiced liars, for lack of a better term, but they're practiced. They're used to being in front of the camera. But the things they've been saying, again, not matching, the obvious tails on the ground, like Lavrov saying basically we had to start a war to stop a war was one of the things that he said, to stop a war or any future wars. And then Maria Butina was repeating some of the stuff about, the Nazification of Ukrainian government. Why? I could expect like the average Russian, Russia Today network anchor not being able to think on their feet. But why do you think these more senior level, the people who are the practiced liars, like they got years of experience at it? Why do you think we're seeing even at their level this discombobulation in their information campaign?
Yeah, I've been spending a lot of time trying to come to terms with that as well. And in my opinion, it seems to be that there is some internal conflict with these individuals where they're trying to protect themselves and their families while still trying to drive this effort to convey that message of, yes, we are loyal to President Putin and to the Communist Party. You know, you bring up the social media part, and I actually was just watching a video on Reddit where a lot of the top social media influencers um, were all recorded saying the same exact message, just in different forms, trying to justify the invasion on Ukraine. And this steps back into that broader messaging, and it looks like there is that they're trying to drive some unification effort in terms of how they're messaging and branding this. Uh, so technology has been their advantage, but it's also been their disadvantage because now you have the individuals who are recording and getting messaging out, you know, what they're seeing in Moscow, such as the protests. You see the arrests occurring. So I think it's that personal image of what they are, what they personally believe versus what they are asked to believe in order to convey that message, and that confusion is causing that personal conflict. What we've seen is majority of the Russian people do not support this effort. Even the captured Russian soldiers, they've even been documented saying, and this could be fake information as well. We don't know, but they've been saying that they've been also fed propaganda. Right. So how deep does this actually go down into the pipeline? But when you look at this and compare to other conflicts that we've seen, this is right now one country against the rest of the country, so to say, based on their actions. And that's really what's driving this effort. I saw something on CNN earlier today about where China is putting some sanctions in order to appease the international community, but they're doing so quietly, right? What does that mean from their perspective and their alliances in contrast to what many other countries have been doing, especially those countries aligned with NATO? So, um, yeah, I mean, it's a tough question to ask. We don't know because it's really going into that component of secrecy. You know, we saw that there was an article where President Putin removed a couple hundred or a couple thousand people from his inner circle, so to say, for suspected poisoning. And I think he's realized that there's some internal conflict with some of his his advisors in terms of the actions. So I think he may be doing somewhat of a purge, so to say, within his party.
Okay. So I want to shift over a little now to more the you touched on there just a little bit the technological side specifically, and again sort of a study in contrast, right? In their past incursions into other countries, we've often seen a disinformation, like a public sort of traditional or social media campaign, combined with some pretty specific technological efforts as well. You know, taking down government websites. Blocking communications architecture and infrastructure to make it, you know, the adversary's communications harder, and it's all part of the same package. So there's been a lot of discussion in that we have not quite seen that on the sort of the hard technological and cyber side in a way that we expected. And now I've also been reading stuff that says, you know, that's not completely true, that there have been things going on, but they're just not quite as visible as, you know, maybe as we expected. But it doesn't mean that there's absolutely nothing going on. But the very visible nature of their previous things was arguably sort of part of the purpose, right? Like, you know, we're going to crash Ukrainian government's website, and you're all going to know about it, kind of thing. So even if there is some sort of cyber activity going on, it does seem to be certainly below the level of immediate observation, and also not as connected with the, you know, the MPs and the foreign speakers and the traditional media sending out their message. Why? What do you think is going on with that disconnection? You know, again, because we have seen something more capable in the past. Between that and the social, you know, the sort of the talking heads on the TV, or is there, to the extent that you're able to talk about it, are there things that just are not making the headlines here, as that have sort of been subsumed by the more visible pictures of, of destruction of civilian infrastructure.
Yeah, so I'll bring it from a couple of different perspectives. One, in terms of what their operations were in Ukraine, we can reasonably assume that that was the Russian government based on what their objectives were. In terms of indirect actions, we could say some of the ransomware effects that we've been seeing and see as a shields up effort as a way to help mitigate that. There's as we know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done before we're able to effectively claim that a nation state was conducting malicious operations on the web. So there could be some of that activity as a way to cause some noise in the system and drive some distraction. But at the same time, and I spoke about this at another podcast 2 weeks ago, and this is what keeps me up at night is with all the sanctions that we're doing, how is that what we saw in Ukraine going to expand into all the other countries, especially United States, that are submitting sanctions? And to your question, we're not seeing a lot of the more advanced capabilities because they don't want to show their hand just yet. But also at the same time, if they're going to take that more aggressive stance, typically that means that, okay, war's been declared. Let's go, boots on ground and start doing what we need to do. And I know a lot of us are, the country's coming out of COVID. I don't think many countries are truly ready to be able to effectively manage the workload and the stress that comes with running a war. So I believe that's why we have not been seeing some of these actions. But then at the same time, when you look at it from a full resource perspective, Russia against NATO countries, even from the war games, it's going to be very, very messy for the Russian government. And then you add the perspective of the people that don't support it, that just adds even more justification as to why they would not do it. Right? They're not going to win. The other side of it is they will use it in a way to be able to drive their own messaging, which they're trying to do, but very localized, right? President Zelensky has been very outspoken, so that's causing that major hurdle. When I worked at PepsiCo, the Russian government accused Pepsi of conducting cyber espionage on some of their systems, and it was interesting for me because I was still a drilling reservist. And I was actually conducting a security assessment on a Russian company at that same time. So you have to be very careful in how you're sending out that message to deploy that particular means of action. And in this case, I don't think it played out to what the Russians' expectation was. And this goes back to that moment or that conversation point of they're scrambling and they're in that state of panic because I don't think they expected this type of opposite reaction, not only by their own people, but by the people of Ukraine, the international community, the sanctions, the oligarchs coming out and saying what they've been saying. And then, how do you effectively manage that communication out as well, especially when it's not within your own borders? So technology has been both that enabler and destroyer from that perspective on both sides. And when we look at it from the information operations domain, Russia is trying to expand its grasp, but it knows it can't do that without having some sort of ramifications even greater than what they're already facing.
Great. Yeah. So speaking of beyond the borders, I wanted to sort of flip and look and get your thoughts on a couple questions here on the the counterpart, right? Like, so again, studying contrast, Russian, state of panic, not executing to the level that we have seen them execute previously. On the flip side, I think it's been fair to say everyone has been seeing an extremely effective Ukrainian combined and harmonious information campaign across all levels. And I've noted this in some of our recent episodes where from the Lance Corporal, I don't know what the equivalent of Schmuckatelli is in Ukrainian, but the lowest Lance Corporal on the battlefield up through different arms of government, civic arms, up to the president, have been sending different pieces and different snapshots, but in a coherent and extremely targeted and certainly effective message. If we're going to go by sanctions, weapons flows going into the country to support their armed forces, humanitarian financial support, all that stuff, it seems to be working. So what are your thoughts on what has allowed the Ukrainians to execute it, especially at this level compared to the Russians, who are probably much more practiced on it? And I've asked this question to other folks on here as well. I'll ask you: is there, from your knowledge, is there something inside Ukrainian sort of civic or military education? Do they have any sort of structured approach where they teach their own people how to operate in this environment? Because it's, to me, it's something that you can't just pick this up and then execute it at a very effective level, the day it's happening, right? You have to have some level of preparation. So, what are your thoughts, or what have you seen previously on how they might have been able to prepare for this so effectively?
Yeah, I mean, from face value, it's, you can't make up facts, right? That's one part of it, right? The second part is, when we look at how typically military operations occur, and as we've known, you always have to have that message communication. You have your orders, you follow your orders to the best of your ability, and you pass that down to your subordinates. And what we've been seeing within the Russian military over time is, we've seen individuals gun decking, for lack of a better term, certain things. We've seen some of their incursions with our interactions with, say, some of our flights that we conduct in the North Atlantic, near the South China Sea, or some of those areas, right? We see that aggressive action. We've seen them buzzing some of the destroyers. You won't see a lot of that in other militaries because of that tight regiment control that we have, and that discipline and rules of engagement that we have defined. And I think that's also what builds onto that as well. But at the end of the day, it's also the messaging that comes from leadership. And the fact that President Zelensky has been very active, boots on ground. You see him with, the bulletproof vest and the ballistics helmet, with the soldiers. That also sends a message. It sends a very, very strong message. So whether he's got some great marketing folks working for him, I mean, that's great. But at the same time, he is exhibiting, the true aspects of a leader. And that is, in my opinion, what is driving a majority of these efforts in terms of how we're able to have this unified message. In contrast to President Putin, where a lot of his messaging is coming behind his office. And that's where we start seeing a lot of this dissent and misinformation, or different perspectives being communicated by the Russian soldiers.
Great, thank you. So I got a couple more thoughts or questions on the Ukrainian side, and then again to the audience, if you have any questions for our guests, just go ahead and start throwing them in the chat, and it'll give me the chance for me to stop talking and get to our audience, which is the more important part here. But so looking at this is another point that's been brought up in some of the previous episodes by our guests, and would like your take on it, is one of the contrast between the two campaigns is all the Russian stuff seems to be landing with a thud, right? Whether it's Lavrov or Putin or Maria Butina or the Russia Today newscaster, our sort of anyone who's not in Russia right now, or a Russian advocate outside of there, sort of receives that message and is automatically like, no, you're full of it. We don't believe anything that you say at all. We're just assumed that you're lying or telling, tiny little bits of truth with lots of obfuscation built around it. On the flip side, as I think specifically our guest last Friday, and that was there's Dr. Matthew Ford and Andrew Hoskins, and they got a forthcoming book on social media and sort of smart social technology on the battlefield. They noted that we seem to be taking a lot of the Ukrainian narrative stuff essentially at face value, and not asking other, not saying that they're passing disinformation, but as they mentioned last Friday, we're certainly not getting the full picture, right? We're getting a crafted picture because some of the things that are sort of noticeable by their absence are, we're not seeing a lot of direct Ukrainian engagements or firefights. We're seeing stuff after the fact. From what I've seen, they've been pretty good about not really saying, what troops are where or sort of who's doing what. And they weren't sort of throwing darts at that, but their fact was we're accepting the Ukrainian side to a very strong degree in the same way that we have a strong counter reaction to the Russian side. And so their thought was, especially after a few years of COVID and all the misinformation, disinformation stuff that was just flowing everywhere through all kinds of channels, why do you think we've suddenly stopped being, or we're credulous when it comes to the Ukrainian side, incredulous when it comes to the Russian side, instead of having a little more circumspection when it comes to both? Why do we just assume that one is, we take it at face value and we assume the other is full of it and there's not more gray area?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that myself as well, and why it seems very one-sided. One aspect is we have a lot of confidence in our intelligence capabilities, and we have some really, really good capabilities. So that's one thing. The other side is it's also being corroborated by our NATO allies, right? So we are able to operate with, as I say, within the nuclear community, a level of confidence, right? But at the same time, does this go back to some of the earlier roots of this country where we were trying to crush out communism, and are we trying to help promote democracy? And I think that's maybe an indirect result out of this action, and opening up some new opportunities for the people of Russia. But yeah, I do agree it has been very one-sided. But then at the same time, when we're painting this picture, we are driving down an emotional impact. We're showing that to say, look, the Russian military is bad. They've done this. They've done X, Y, Z. Why are they invading this country when they had no need to? There was the whole situation with Crimea, which you can understand both from a strategic perspective as well as from a military tactical perspective. But I think a lot of folks are missing some of the historical aspects back when it was the Warsaw Pact, and really what it comes down from that perspective. At the end of the day, I'm not sure why it's very one-sided, but I fundamentally believe that we're trying to drive an emotional response to be able to reduce a supposed risk with Russia being communist, and with some of their activities that they've been doing from a nation state perspective. I mean, that's just, from my opinion, what I've seen on the outside. I mean, what we've seen on the inside is a little different conversation and among different communication means. But I mean, only time will tell, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, that's one thing to definitely keep in mind, and something that I do have to remind myself of periodically, and I should know better as a history major myself, right? Like, we're 4 weeks into something that is going to reverberate across decades following. So, there's only so far hot takes are going to take us for good lessons learned. But with what we do know now, I want to switch a little bit from to a different theater, and look at and get your thoughts on what you think some of the implications potentially for China and their influence in both the Pacific and their larger, really their global influence in trying to spread out, economically and diplomatically, and gain footholds where they've been trying to for a while now. Because we are all watching what's going on in Ukraine, and a lot of folks have also been like, China's watching too, Taiwan is watching too, all of their neighbors around there are watching too and taking notes. So what do you think in terms of the information realm, and the disinformation side as well? Because we know China plays in that field too, and up until Russia started this war, we thought that Russia was fairly effective in that realm until they invaded. There's been a lot of the perception, I think it's fair to say, of China as well has been fairly effective, not always subtle, but at least effective in putting out its own message and its own counter narratives and trying to obfuscate or clamp down on the piece of information they don't want to talk about. So what do you think are some of the implications we might see in future relations with us in China, with Taiwan and China, and with its other neighbors out there in the information space coming out of this war?
Yeah, well, first of all, the Chinese government is very well organized and they have things quite locked down. So we're going to see um, the delivery of their capabilities in a far more organized and a far more tactical method of operation. Uh, at the same time, though, when Russia did start that invasion, the Chinese Air Force actually did have some jets fly close to Taiwan, and we caught them, right? But I think that was a way for them to determine what are our current capabilities based on what they're able to find. At the same time, though, with all the data mining that they are doing, it looks like they're trying to find very common vulnerabilities that exist across public and private infrastructure, critical infrastructure, and my prediction is that when they do decide to act, they're just going to throw everything that's very common, try to utilize denial of service-based capabilities, pull out common ransomware attacks, just try to create a lot of noise and a lot of disruption as a way to mitigate some of their other actions that they may be doing. The other side of it is, which plays back to the results of this interaction between Russia and Ukraine, is will Russia be the same or will it be different, both militarily and economically? And if it does change, how is that going to affect China's ability for them to continue some of their efforts in the not only from the military perspective, but weapons manufacturing, their efforts to expand their navy, and some of those ramifications. So, yeah, in a nutshell, yes, this is a great learning opportunity for the Chinese government on what not to do. But at the same time, they need to realize who are their effective allies in this process so that they're able to drive more unification in that effort so they choose. And I don't think they have that level of unification or um, process. I mean, you look at the history of China, they've gone from a lot of panic. They've learned from that, from a lot of chaos, as it was multiple different regions into now one country. But do they have other countries that agree with their stance, their perspectives on communism and the China first mentality, right? It's going from patriotism to nationalism. So it'll be interesting to see if we have the answers we will be having this conversation, right? But it'll certainly be we'll certainly start seeing some more advanced, more thought out, more very tactical capabilities being pushed out by the Chinese government as they pursue this. And if Russia remains unchanged and still continues to be communist, from what we've seen from the oppression, then I see Russia being the closest ally towards this effort, and those two countries driving unified effort in terms of whether it be a kinetic or not kinetic form of warfare. My prediction is Russia will be changed, and there will be a movement towards democracy, a more official democracy, not an impression of democracy, and that will dramatically impact China's various 5-year plans that they have created to be able to support the growth of their country.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, I'd agree that whatever happens, Russia will be different, which will certainly have a different range of options for how China's relation with them are going to continue. Whether they continue to be a partner, a millstone around their necks if things go really, really badly, or even potentially a less friendly competitor, if there is some sort of radical sea change. Although again, very early to tell on that angle. So one more question, and then to the audience, if there's no other questions coming in from the chat, we'll go ahead and give everybody a little bit of time here on a nice Friday afternoon. But so we talked about Russia, we talked about Ukraine, talked counter narratives and counter information, or Chinese approach potentially as well. What specifically for both the United States inside the military, inside government arms, and if you're comfortable, maybe in a more broader cultural context, but what steps or what lessons do you think we could take to, or have we taken already to perhaps better inoculate ourselves against a robust misinformation, disinformation campaign coming from another competitor? And you could, going back to my earlier comments, maybe you could argue some of that's already happened, because almost nobody here, with a handful of exceptions, takes anything that a Russian organ is saying today, with any belief that it's in good faith, right? The assumption is they're not telling the truth, or they're lying, or they're at least being incomplete, and they're not in good faith. So maybe that's already a evidence that something has changed. But it seems that there might be some other more sort of concrete actions that could be taken. Again, not knowing how Ukrainian society has done it, I can't speculate. But I also know some of the Baltic states and some Scandinavian nations actually have some sort of formal civic education programs where they try and help people on from sort of school age up understand that they are a target of these campaigns potentially, and give them some tools and things to think about to keep them from being targeted successfully. So what are some things you think we could do better on both the DoD and sort of our national side over here as a whole, or what are some things you've already been seeing maybe that suggest we're going in that direction already?
Yeah, I from what I've seen from the government DoD side, we have that, sense of patriotism, which has helped driving it. But unfortunately, as we saw with the January 6th insurrection, there is still a large amount of ignorance within the American public that gets clouded under the guise of freedom. And, to the point about these classes, could that be construed as government involvement? Right, kind of going into a little bit of that state of paranoia. So how do we craft that message where we're able to deliver information in that factual manner, but also without driving a large component of emotion? And part of that comes down to how information is being disseminated into this country. We had a couple Russian-owned news companies that are banned off of YouTube now, that are no longer to be able to broadcast their information, right? That's one step in the direction to be able to control it. But then at the same time, who is going to be that deciding factor on what is truly factual or not? It gets into a very broad ethical conversation, a moral conversation. And you have to have a certain level of implied trust that the individuals who are giving this information and who are receiving this information are truly providing it for the right effort. And I don't think that's ever going to occur. That the component of freedom definitely adds more complexity to it. And fortunately or unfortunately, whatever your decision, the United States has been that factor that's been able to push that idea across. I'm thinking back to to the West Wing, where the chief speechwriter, he said, our democracy is the most dangerous export that we send out, right? And there is some truth behind it, because while democracy is great and all, that ideas could, the free ideas could lead to a certain level of paranoia or differing of opinion, where the emotional state gets activated, and then you start seeing this very direct response as a result of that. So I think I agree with their point of having some of those conversations, educational aspects, with providing the information to how do you determine if something is factual or not. Uh, but it also comes down to what's being put in our textbook. How are we teaching individuals to do active research? Um, I remember back when I was really young, I found a certain article that was written by an individual, and I sent that to an individual that I trusted, and I said, what's your opinion on this? And he said, one thing you need to learn is not everything on the web is always going to be factual, and it could be done by another country who may deem it legal while we consider it here in the States illegal. So, always go to at least 4 to 5 different sources, be able to read everything as much as you can and then make your decision, and always have an ability and a way to justify why do you have this thought in a manner that you can articulate effectively. And then based on that, have the conversation, have the discussion, and then it'll proceed whether other individuals want to have their opinions. So that's the approach I've taken over the years when I have a lot of these conversations. But I don't think it's going to change. I don't think it's going to be something we're going to have any steps to try to remediate other than sanctions. It'll be something that we are continuously fighting as these little skirmishes continue.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, you're just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's factual. I've told my kids that almost verbatim on any number of school projects, because all you need is a keyboard and some way to get the stuff on there. But also I think you made an interesting point as well earlier about the influence and power of some of those platforms. And in fact, our guest last Friday talked about the gatekeepers and how, for the really big, social media and technology platforms, they didn't necessarily create a system to be like that, but it turns out they do have tremendous influence and power to be, potentially arbiters of what's on there and what's not. And I think that's definitely something over the past few years, and then this war has really, really shown it when companies have taken it away from Russia, right? Like that's where we're all sort of really starting to appreciate that there's a tremendous ability to influence just in those platforms. What do we do with it? And they didn't necessarily ask to be gatekeepers when they created, but they are now, like, de facto. So how do you gatekeep responsibly, and how do you gatekeep in different countries that all have different rules for what goes on there and what doesn't?
Yeah, but they're also private organizations too, and that's the icing on the cake, which makes it even more difficult to administer. Because now, even though you still have this data, you still have the connections, and you can put as much regulation as you want. How are you still going to be able to control it? And theoretically, you can't. I mean, it's still always going to be accessible so long as the people want it. But yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see how this continues to play out and how this continues to affect the world, especially as we drive more expansion of technology and more ease of use. It's not going to get easier. We know that for a fact. But yeah, I think getting education, having conversations like this are definitely going to be helpful in driving some of that awareness and the ability for individuals to just stop and take a moment to say, is this truly factual, or is this someone simply expressing their opinion and trying to spin it off as fact?
Yeah, and in fact, I think that is a great note to wrap things up on here. And so to Mr. Arvin Verma, sir, thank you very much for your time today. I'll extend the same gratitude I have extended to a lot of our guests lately, which is I've been giving people very short notice to come and do a lot of and share their insights with us. But I think it's been incredibly valuable for our audience, because as much as it's horrifying to watch this all unfold in real time, there are things to be learned from it. And there's, certainly from our angle as a Center for Future Warfare, and as well as part of a military educational enterprise, like, we better be learning this stuff as professionals, because today it's not our turn. We get the chance to learn some very hard lessons from other people's challenges, let's learn those lessons, before the day comes when it's our challenge. So thank you very much for sharing your time. To our audience, thank you again for joining us. This is, I think, the most robust schedule we've had this week. We've had some great attendance. So thank you for taking the time out of a Friday afternoon. And again, we'll continue to have these scheduled and put out as we get our hands on expert speakers, again, because this conflict is not going away anytime soon. So we're going to do our best to learn from it and share that information in the moment so that we can get that information out usefully in the moment. So again, sir, thank you very much.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.